Pablo Escobar said the only person I ever feared was a woman named Griselda Blanco. Here's why. December 15th, 1989. A heavily guarded compound outside Medellin, Colombia. Pablo Escobar sat behind a mahogany desk that had once belonged to a Colombian president, facing a journalist conducting what would become one of his final interviews. The man who controlled 80% of the world's cocaine trade was asked a deceptively simple question. In your entire career, who did you fear most? The journalist expected Pablo to mention the DEA or perhaps the Colombian military. Instead, without hesitation, Pablo answered, "The only person I was ever afraid of was a woman named Griselda Blanco. More than the DEA, more than the Colombian military, more than rival cartels with thousands of soldiers." Pablo's laugh was soft, almost nostalgic. He stood up and walked to the window, his eyes scanning the coffee plantations that stretched toward the mountains beyond. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quality the journalist had never heard before, something that might have been respect tinged with genuine unease. "You don't understand," Pablo said quietly. "Governments you can negotiate with because they want something: money, power, stability. Military forces you can outgun because they follow predictable tactics and have bureaucratic limitations. Rival cartels you can understand because they think like you do. They're emotional, territorial, driven by the same desires for wealth and recognition." He turned back, his expression more serious than before. But Griselda was different. She thought 10 moves ahead while everyone else was still learning the rules of the game. Every choice was calculated. Every move part of a larger design that could take years to reveal itself. Pablo opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder of photographs and documents. "I kept files on everyone who might become a threat. Politicians, military leaders, rival traffickers, everyone except Griselda. You know why? Because every time I thought I understood her system, I discovered it was more sophisticated than I had imagined." This is the story of why the king of cocaine admitted that a woman from the barrios of Medellin was the only person who ever made him lose sleep at night. To understand Pablo's fear, you need to understand what Griselda Blanco had accomplished by 1989, and more importantly, how she had accomplished it. While Pablo built his empire through spectacle, bombing government buildings, assassinating politicians, waging open war against entire nations, Griselda had built something far more dangerous: invisibility. By the late 1980s, Griselda controlled an estimated 40% of cocaine entering the United States. But her market share numbers told only part of the story. What made her truly formidable was the architecture of her operation. Pablo's organization was a pyramid with himself at the apex. Remove Pablo and the entire structure would collapse within months. His lieutenants were loyal, but they were also dependent. Every major decision flowed through him. Every significant operation required his personal approval. Griselda's network was something entirely different. A web of interconnected cells that could function independently when necessary, but operated with devastating efficiency when coordinated. Her lieutenants weren't just employees, they were partners with their own territories, their own specialties, their own reasons to ensure the network's continued success. Where Pablo's operations generated headlines and attracted international attention, making him the most wanted man in the world, Griselda's network operated in complete silence. No bombings that made front-page news. No public declarations of war against governments. No theatrical displays of power designed to terrorize enemies and impress allies. Just results. Devastating, efficient, unstoppable results. Her distribution networks moved product through American cities with a precision that made Pablo's operations look amateur by comparison. Where his people relied on violence and intimidation to maintain territory, Griselda's organization used financial incentives and long-term partnerships that made cooperation more profitable than resistance. Her money laundering systems were so sophisticated that American banking authorities couldn't trace funds even when they knew which specific accounts to investigate. Her corruption networks included judges, police officials, customs agents, and politicians at every level of government. Pablo feared her because he understood something that law enforcement agencies were just beginning to grasp. Spectacle is weakness. When you announce your power, you give your enemies a target. When you declare war, you invite retaliation. When you make yourself famous, you make yourself vulnerable. Griselda had done none of these things. She had become more powerful than Pablo while remaining completely invisible to the world that was hunting him. By 1989, there were thousands of DEA agents dedicated to capturing or killing Pablo Escobar. Entire government task forces had been created specifically to destroy his organization. Meanwhile, most American law enforcement officials had never even heard the name Griselda Blanco. But Pablo's fear wasn't just professional, it was personal. He had tried on 3 separate occasions to establish control over Griselda's operations. Each time he had been outmaneuvered so thoroughly that he began questioning his own intelligence. The first attempt came in early 1982 when Pablo was at the absolute height of his power. His organization was generating over $4 billion annually. Colombian politicians either worked for him or lived in fear of him. He controlled transportation routes throughout South America and had established distribution networks in every major American city. From his perspective, approaching Griselda for coordination made perfect strategic sense. 2 Colombian organizations working together could eliminate wasteful competition, reduce law enforcement pressure, and maximize profits for everyone involved. He sent his most trusted emissary, his cousin Eduardo, a man who had been with Pablo since the beginning of his rise to power. Eduardo was intelligent, diplomatic, and absolutely loyal. More importantly, he was family, which in Pablo's world meant his discretion was guaranteed by bonds stronger than fear or money. Eduardo spent 3 weeks in Miami, meeting with various intermediaries, working through layers of security and protocol to arrange a meeting with someone who could speak for Griselda's organization. He was impressed by the sophistication of her people. Every contact was professional, knowledgeable, clearly operating according to well-established procedures. When the meeting finally happened, it was in a luxury hotel suite overlooking Biscayne Bay. Eduardo expected to meet with one of Griselda's lieutenants. Instead, Griselda walked into the room personally. Elegant, soft-spoken, completely in control of every aspect of the conversation. She listened to Pablo's proposal without interruption, asked several specific questions about operational details, and thanked Eduardo graciously for making the trip to Miami. Then she delivered her response. "Please tell Pablo I appreciate his interest in coordination. My operations are already perfectly coordinated with the people who matter." As Eduardo prepared to leave the hotel, Griselda made one final comment that didn't make sense until much later. "Also, please tell Pablo that I look forward to working more closely with you personally in the months ahead." Eduardo returned to Medellin, confused but impressed. He delivered her message word for word, and both men interpreted it as a diplomatic way of maintaining independence while leaving doors open for future conversations. 6 months later, Pablo discovered the real meaning behind Griselda's final comment. Eduardo had been quietly providing detailed information to Griselda's organization since before he had even made the trip to Miami. Bank account numbers, transportation schedules, security procedures, personnel information, everything. But this wasn't simple bribery or intimidation. Eduardo hadn't been threatened or bought. He had been convinced through months of careful psychological manipulation that Pablo's interests would be better served through subtle cooperation with Griselda's network than through competition. The recruitment had been so sophisticated that Eduardo genuinely believed he was protecting Pablo by maintaining contact with Griselda's people. He had been providing intelligence for months without realizing it was intelligence, believing instead that he was engaged in beneficial coordination. When confronted with evidence, Eduardo was genuinely shocked to learn his activities constituted betrayal. He had been so skillfully managed that he hadn't understood the true nature of his relationship with Griselda's organization. Pablo realized Griselda hadn't just rejected his partnership, she had demonstrated that his own family could be turned against him without them knowing. The second attempt was more direct. In 1984, Pablo proposed a face-to-face meeting at a private club in Panama City, neutral territory, maximum security. Pablo arrived with 12 bodyguards and detailed security plans. Griselda arrived alone, wearing a simple black dress, looking like a businesswoman attending a routine meeting. Her composure was more unnerving than if she had arrived with an army. They sat at a mahogany table discussing neutral topics before turning to business. The conversation was unlike any negotiation Pablo had experienced. No threats, just clinical discussion. Griselda's questions revealed encyclopedic knowledge of Pablo's operations, while Pablo realized he knew almost nothing about her organization's mechanics. After exactly 1 hour, Griselda stood to leave. Pablo, confused by the civility, asked, "So we understand each other?" Griselda paused at the door. "Pablo, you understand me perfectly. The question is whether you understand yourself." Within 48 hours, Pablo discovered 3 of his most trusted lieutenants had quietly disappeared from his organization. All 3 had been recruited by Griselda months before the meeting. She hadn't come to negotiate, she had come to demonstrate that his inner circle was already compromised. Within 48 hours, Pablo discovered 3 of his most trusted lieutenants. Men who had been with him for over 5 years had quietly disappeared from his organization. All 3 had been recruited by Griselda months before the meeting. She hadn't come to negotiate. She had come to demonstrate that his inner circle was already compromised. 3 of his most trusted lieutenants, men who had been with him for over 5 years, quietly disappeared from his organization. Not killed, not kidnapped, just gone. Pablo's intelligence network eventually determined that all 3 had been recruited by Griselda's organization months before the meeting. She hadn't come to negotiate. She had come to demonstrate that his inner circle was already compromised. The 3rd and final attempt was the one that convinced Pablo that Griselda Blanco was not just his equal, but potentially his superior. In 1986, Pablo decided to test her directly. He began moving product through routes that technically fell within Griselda's established territories. Not enough to justify open conflict, but enough to measure her response. For 6 months, nothing happened. Pablo's shipments moved without interference. His people reported no unusual activity from Griselda's organization. No complaints, no warnings, no indication that she had even noticed his incursions. Pablo began to think he had overestimated her. Then on a Tuesday morning in March 1987, Pablo discovered that every major distribution network he controlled in the United States had been quietly infiltrated by Griselda's people. Not recently, for years. His American operations weren't independent business ventures. They were subcontractors in a system that Griselda had designed and controlled from the beginning. Every dollar Pablo thought he was earning independently in the United States was actually flowing through networks that ultimately answered to Madrina. She hadn't been ignoring his territorial challenges. She had been allowing him to believe he was challenging territory that had never really been his. Pablo realized that he hadn't been testing Griselda. She had been testing him, and he had failed. That night, Pablo made a phone call to Miami. When Griselda answered, he said just 5 words. "I respect your superior position." Griselda's response was equally brief. "I've always respected yours, Pablo." In Colombia, the message was clear. Colombia was Pablo's domain. Everything else belonged to her, but Pablo's fear of Griselda wasn't based solely on her business acumen. It was based on something more fundamental. He couldn't predict her. Pablo understood his other enemies because they were like him. Emotional, reactive, driven by ego and the need for recognition. When politicians attacked him, he could predict they would escalate until public pressure forced them to negotiate. When rival cartels challenged him, he could anticipate they would either submit to superior force or fight until they were destroyed. Griselda followed none of these patterns. She never escalated conflicts unnecessarily, but she never backed down when her core interests were threatened. She never sought publicity, but she never allowed disrespect to go unanswered. She never made threats, but her promises, both positive and negative, were kept with mathematical precision. This unpredictability made her dangerous in ways that Pablo's other enemies were not. He could plan for conventional responses, but Griselda's responses were anything but conventional. In 1988, a rival organization made the mistake of targeting one of Griselda's key lieutenants. Pablo watched carefully to see how she would respond, hoping to gain insight into her operational methods. What happened next confirmed his worst fears about her capabilities. The rival organization didn't just lose the lieutenant who had authorized the attack, they lost their entire leadership structure over a period of 6 months. Not through dramatic assassinations or violent confrontations, but through a series of seemingly unrelated events that destroyed their network from within. Key personnel quit unexpectedly. Financial accounts were mysteriously empty. Distribution routes stopped functioning. Suppliers found more attractive opportunities elsewhere. Within half a year, an organization that had taken a decade to build simply evaporated. No one could prove that Griselda was responsible. There was no evidence, no witnesses, no direct connections between her people and the systematic destruction of her enemies. But Pablo understood that the absence of evidence was itself evidence of Griselda's superiority. She had eliminated a major threat without creating any legal vulnerability for herself or her organization. This was the level of strategic thinking that kept Pablo awake at night. His enemies fought him directly, which meant he could fight back. Griselda's enemies simply ceased to exist, and no one could explain exactly how or why. By 1989, when Pablo gave that infamous interview, he had reached a conclusion. Griselda Blanco represented an entirely different category of criminal intelligence. Most people in this business, Pablo told the journalist, are driven by money, power, or revenge. Griselda was driven by systematic perfection. She didn't want to be the richest or most famous. She wanted to build something that couldn't be touched, couldn't be stopped, couldn't even be fully understood. He paused, staring at his folder of intelligence on dozens of rivals.
That's what made her truly dangerous.
Not violence. I could match that. Not intelligence. I could match that.
She was patient. She could wait years for the perfect moment.
She could sacrifice immediate profits for long-term advantage. She could let enemies think they were winning while building the system that would make their victories meaningless. The journalist asked if Pablo had ever considered eliminating Griselda directly. Pablo's laugh was bitter. You can't eliminate someone you can't find, and by the time I understood what she was, it was too late. Our businesses had become so interconnected that attacking her would have been attacking myself. He pulled out a surveillance photograph of Griselda at Miami Beach, looking like any wealthy woman enjoying retirement. This is the most dangerous person I encountered in 20 years. She looks like someone's grandmother. No weapons, no bodyguards, no obvious signs of power. He set the photograph down carefully. That invisibility was her greatest weapon. I made myself famous, and fame made me a target. She made herself indispensable, and indispensability made her untouchable. Pablo Escobar was killed by Colombian police in December 1993, his location betrayed by surveillance technology. He died violently, dramatically, matching the spectacular approach that defined his career. Griselda Blanco was arrested in 1985, but continued coordinating operations from prison through networks, so sophisticated that law enforcement never understood how they functioned. She was deported in 2004 and lived quietly until 2012. The difference in their fates illustrates why Pablo feared her. His dramatic approach made him a target that law enforcement could eventually eliminate. Griselda's systematic approach made her a ghost that haunted the drug trade for decades without becoming vulnerable to frontal assault. The woman who made Pablo Escobar afraid proved that the most dangerous person isn't necessarily the one everyone is watching, but the one who is watching everyone else. Pablo's fear wasn't about what she might do to him. It was about what she had already done. Built a better system, established superior methods, achieved greater sustainability while remaining invisible. She had shown him that everything he thought he knew about power was incomplete. In the end, Pablo's admission wasn't a confession of weakness. It was recognition of superiority by someone who understood the game well enough to know when he had been outplayed. Even the king of cocaine understood when he was in the presence of true royalty. And Griselda Blanco was the undisputed queen of the game, the only person Pablo Escobar ever feared, and the only person who never needed to fear him back. Because when you've perfected the art of being inevitable, fear becomes irrelevant. And Griselda Blanco was inevitable.